At 2 o'clock in the morning on November 2nd, 1984, a 52-year-old woman named Velma Barfield was executed by lethal injection at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. She had chosen to wear her pink cotton pajamas, not the prison-issue dress, not something formal or symbolic. Her pajamas, the ones she slept in, the ones that were softest against her skin. She had asked earlier that day whether she could donate her organs after she died. Whatever could be used, she said. Whatever was still good. Outside the prison, 300 people stood in the November dark, holding candles. They were there to protest the execution, to say that Velma Barfield had changed, that she had found God in her years on death row, that a woman who ministered to inmates and corresponded with Billy Graham and had become by any account a different person than the one who had been arrested 6 years earlier, was not the person who should be executed. They stood with their candles, and they blew them out at 2 o'clock the moment the injection was administered. On the other side of the street, a smaller group had gathered in support of the execution. When the moment came, some of them shouted things that I will not repeat here. The division between the people with the candles and the people across the street said something about how a community receives a story like this one. About how the same facts, the same life, the same woman in pink pajamas can be read so differently by people standing 20 feet apart. Velma Barfield was the first woman executed in the United States in 22 years. She was the first woman ever executed by lethal injection. She had killed at least 4 people, possibly more over the course of nearly a decade, poisoning them with arsenic while they slept, and while they trusted her, and while the community around her saw nothing at all. This is not a story about whether she deserved to die. That question was answered in the formal sense by the courts of North Carolina and the governor, who declined to intervene. This is a story about what the community around her missed, about the particular kind of blindness that comes from trust, from the accumulated evidence of a person's daily life, the small consistent kindnesses, the presence in the front pew on Sunday morning, the voice in the choir, about how long that blindness can last, and about what it costs when it ends. Robeson County in the 1970s was a place of particular social texture. It sat in the southeastern corner of North Carolina in the flat coastal plain country, a county with a complicated racial and economic history. Poor in ways that had been poor for generations, with a population that mixed white-black and Lumbee Native American families who had lived alongside each other for longer than most American counties had existed. The churches were the anchors of community life in Robeson County, in the way that churches are anchors in rural southern communities, not just spiritually, but socially, the places where people gathered and were seen and were known. Your standing in a community like that was built over years of presence, over the small, consistent demonstrations of who you were. Velma Barfield had built that standing carefully. She taught Sunday school at her church. She sang in the choir. She was known as a devout woman, a woman of genuine faith, not the performative kind that people assume in order to manage a reputation, but the real kind, the kind that got her up early on Sunday mornings and kept her there past noon and brought her back on Wednesday evenings. Her neighbors would have told you she was good. Her church community would have told you she was good. The families who hired her to care for their elderly relatives would have told you she was exactly the kind of person you wanted in that role, patient, attentive, present. She was also, during those same years, stealing money from the people she cared for, forging checks against their accounts, and poisoning them with arsenic when she feared they might discover what she had done. Both of those things were true at the same time. That is the thing about Velma Barfield that does not resolve easily. She was not a performance of goodness concealing a hidden self that was its opposite. She was someone in whom genuine faith and genuine care and genuine violence coexisted in a way that the people around her never fully saw, because the faith and the care were so present and so consistent that there was no room left in the picture for anything else. She was born in 1932 in South Carolina, the second of 9 children, and grew up in Robeson County after her family moved across the state line when she was still young. The house she grew up in was marked by the kind of poverty that is not just an absence of money, but an absence of safety. Her father was violent, unpredictable, a man whose behavior at home bore no relationship to the man the community saw at church. She claimed later in her life that he had sexually abused her when she was a child. Whether that claim was accurate or not, the damage of those years was real, and it ran deep, and it shaped the rest of her life in ways that are not simple to untangle. She married at 17. His name was Thomas Burke, and she married him the way young women in those circumstances sometimes marry to get out to establish a household that was hers and not her father's, to create some version of safety that the house she grew up in had never provided. For a while it worked. They had 2 children. They built a modest life in Parkton. There were years that were, by her account and by her children's accounts, genuinely good. Then the back pain started, a hysterectomy in the mid-1960s, and the recovery that followed, and the particular way that pain management worked in rural North Carolina in those years, which was to say that doctors prescribed what they had, which was tranquilizers and sedatives and painkillers, and that the prescription was renewed when requested, and that nobody used the word addiction, because nobody had a language for what was happening yet. Velma Barfield became dependent on prescription medication in a time and place where that dependency was invisible. It was invisible to her doctors who saw a woman in pain asking for relief. It was invisible to her neighbors who saw a woman who sometimes seemed tired or slow, but who was always at church. It was for a long time invisible to her. What was not invisible was the money. Addiction is expensive, and the prescriptions cost more than she could manage, and she began to borrow money she couldn't repay, and then to forge checks, and then to falsify documents. Small amounts at first, then larger ones, always from people who trusted her, her husband, her mother, the family she worked for, always with the intention, she said, of paying it back before anyone noticed. When it became clear that someone was going to notice that the numbers were going to be looked at and the discrepancy was going to be found, she added something to their food. She later said that the first time she had not intended to kill anyone. She had only wanted to make them sick enough to be distracted from the finances. She had used a pesticide she had in the house. Arsenic compounds in various forms were available over the counter in North Carolina in the early 1970s for agricultural and pest control purposes. She had some. Whether she told herself she was not trying to kill them is something only she knew. What happened is that they got sick, and then they got sicker, and then they died, and the doctors who attended them found nothing unusual, because the symptoms of arsenic poisoning, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain look, without a specific test, like any number of natural conditions in elderly and infirm patients. And nobody ordered the specific test because there was no reason to order it. Velma Barfield was a caring woman. Everyone said so. The first person to die was Thomas Burke, her first husband. On April 4th, 1969, while Velma and the children were away from the house, it caught fire. Thomas was inside. He died in the fire. The investigation concluded it was accidental. A cigarette possibly left burning while he slept. Velma collected the life insurance. She did not remarry immediately. Within a year, the house burned again. Another insurance payment. In 1970, she married a widower named Jennings Barfield. He was disabled and in fragile health and needed someone to take care of him. Velma took care of him with the attentiveness that had always characterized her caregiving. She was there when he needed medication. There when he needed meals, there in the particular way of a person who has organized her identity around the role of caregiver. In 1971, he died of what his doctors attributed to heart failure. He had been vomiting and in pain for days before he died. His symptoms were consistent with any number of conditions that afflict elderly men in poor health. No autopsy was performed. There was no reason to perform one. Velma was a devoted caregiver. The community came to the funeral and expressed their condolences and watched her grieve and thought nothing unusual. Her mother Lillian died in 1974. The relationship between Velma and her mother had always been complicated. The complicated relationship of a daughter who had been hurt in her childhood home and had never fully separated that hurt from the woman who had not stopped it. She had moved in with Lillian after Jennings died, and the two women had lived together in the particular friction of that history. Lillian's illness when it came was rapid and characterized by the same symptoms as Jennings's vomiting abdominal pain, the body shutting down in ways that looked, without specific investigation, like the natural failure of an aging system. The doctors attributed it to natural causes. No autopsy. At every point in this sequence, the absence of investigation made sense. Velma was known. She was trusted. The people who died were elderly or infirm or both. Their deaths fit the shape of the lives they had been living. There was nothing from the outside that pointed toward anything other than the natural course of things. Dolly Edwards, an 80-year-old woman whose family had hired Velma to care for her, died in 1977. John Lee Moore, a 56-year-old man whose family had also hired Velma, died later that year. Both deaths were attributed to natural causes. Both families had trusted Velma with the most vulnerable people in their lives. Think about what it means to hire someone to care for an elderly parent. You have made a judgment about this person's character, about what you have seen of them in the community, about the accumulated evidence of who they are. You leave your parent in their hands, and you go to work, and you trust that the judgment you made was correct. And when the person dies, you grieve, and the grief is real, and the possibility that the caregiver you trusted might have had something to do with it does not occur to you. Because why would it? She was known. She was good. Everybody said so. Stuart Taylor was Velma's fiancé. They had been together for several years, and by the account of people who knew them, he cared for her genuinely, and she for him. He was a farmer, a straightforward man, a church-going man, the kind of man who drove his girlfriend to revival meetings because he knew she wanted to go, who sat in the pew beside her even when the faith wasn't his own, who accommodated her world because he loved her. In early 1978, Velma forged checks against his account to pay for her prescriptions. When she realized he was going to discover the forgeries, she added arsenic to his beer. He became ill and did not recover. He died on February 4th, 1978. His family, unlike the families before them, was not satisfied with the explanation. His relatives had seen him in reasonable health, had known him as a strong man, had watched him decline suddenly and severely. They requested an autopsy. The autopsy found arsenic. Velma was arrested on May 13, 1978. When the investigators brought her in for questioning, she did not hold back for long. She confessed to poisoning Stuart Taylor. Then she confessed to more. Her mother, Dolly Edwards, John Henry Lee. The confessions came in a way that her attorneys would later describe as a woman who had been carrying something too heavy for too long, and who, when given the opportunity to set it down, did not know how to stop. She told them things they had not asked about. She told them things they might never have found on their own. Her son Ronnie received 2 phone calls that night. The first told him his mother had been arrested in connection with Stuart Taylor's death. The second, a few hours later, told him she had confessed to killing his grandmother. And 2 other people he had not known were in danger. He had not known. That is the thing that stays with me about Ronnie Burke. He had not known. He had visited his mother in prison after the arrest and sat across from her and looked at her face, the face he had known his whole life, and tried to understand how the person he was looking at and the person being described to him could be the same person. How the woman who had raised him and gone to church with him and sat in the front pew every Sunday morning could have poisoned his grandmother. He eventually became one of his mother's most vocal advocates for clemency. He believed she had changed. He believed she was not the same person who had done those things. He visited her on death row and wrote letters on her behalf and appeared in public to argue for her life. What he was arguing for, what he understood better than almost anyone, was not that she was innocent, but that the person she was in 1984 was not the person she had been in 1974, or 1977, or 1978. And that the execution of the 1984 person for the acts of the earlier one raised a question that the law was not equipped to answer. Velma Barfield spent 6 years on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh, in an area designated for escape-prone prisoners. Because there was no separate women's death row, she was the only woman under a death sentence in North Carolina at the time. She was placed among men who were awaiting execution in a section that was not designed for her situation in the institutional isolation that death row produces in people who spend years there. What she did in those 6 years was visible and documented and, by all accounts, genuine. She led Bible study. She corresponded with other inmates, with prison staff, with strangers who wrote to her after learning about her case. She developed friendships with women in the prison's general population who sought her out for counsel. She wrote a memoir. She cultivated a relationship with the Graham family, Billy Graham, the most famous evangelist in America, and his daughter Anne, who visited her and became by any account a real friend. Anne Graham Lotz was present at the execution. She stayed until the end. The question of whether Velma Barfield's transformation was real is one that people who knew her, people who studied her case, and people who wrote about her have been arguing about for 40 years. I am not going to resolve it here. What I will say is that the people who were closest to her, who saw her not on television or in newspaper accounts, but in person across a table over years, believed it was real. And I will also say that the question of whether it was real may be in some sense the wrong question. Because whatever she became in those 6 years, it did not change what she had done. It did not change what the families of her victims were living with. It did not change the fact that she had poisoned her own mother and the two elderly people whose families had trusted her and the man she was going to marry. Governor Jim Hunt declined to grant clemency. He was in the middle of a Senate race challenging Jesse Helms, one of the closest and most watched races in North Carolina political history. The timing of the execution the week before the election was noted by observers at the time. Hunt denied that politics played any role in his decision. He said the evidence of guilt was overwhelming and that the process had been fair. The Senate race was extremely close. Hunt lost. At 2 o'clock in the morning on November 2nd, 1984, the injection was administered. Anne Graham Lotz was in the room. Ronnie Burke had been there earlier in the evening and had said goodbye. The prison chaplain was present. Velma Barfield died in her pink pajamas. Outside, the candles were blown out. The people across the street went home. The prison returned to its ordinary institutional quiet. In Robeson County, the families of the people Velma had poisoned lived with what they had been living with for 6 years, which was the specific and irreversible knowledge that they had trusted her, that their trust had been used against the people most in need of protection, and that this knowledge could not be unknowed. I want to say something about what happened in Robeson County for 9 years, from 1969 to 1978, while Velma Barfield was doing what she was doing. Nothing obvious happened. That is the point. The community went about its life. People went to church and Velma was in the choir. People hired her to care for their relatives, and their relatives were cared for attentively and genuinely right up to the moment they were not. Nobody looked at Velma Barfield and thought, "There is something I am not seeing." They looked at her and saw what they had always seen, which was the sum of every Sunday morning and every church supper and every act of genuine care that she had performed over decades. The blindness was not stupidity, it was the ordinary operation of trust in a community that runs on trust, the same mechanism that makes it possible to live in close proximity to people you have not personally examined, to rely on the accumulated evidence of behavior over time rather than constant surveillance. Most of the time that mechanism works. Most of the time, the person in the front pew is who the front pew suggests they are. The trouble is that the same mechanism that allows trust to function also creates the conditions under which a person like Velma Barfield can operate for 9 years without detection. Not because the community was unusually naive or unusually careless, but because the evidence they had, the church attendance, the caregiving, the Sunday school class, the choir was real evidence. It was just incomplete. What was not in evidence was what happened after Thomas Burke's insurance check arrived. What happened after Jennings Barfield's health began to fail. What happened in the privacy of kitchens and bedrooms, and the small spaces where money was counted and checks were written, and the gap between what was owed and what was available grew wider and more frightening. What was not in evidence was the cabinet in the kitchen where the arsenic compound sat. The calculations a person makes when they are desperate in a way that is invisible to the people around them. The distance between what a person shows and what a person is doing maintained, not through careful deception but through the simple fact that most of what any of us does is never seen by anyone. A person's life has rooms that their community never enters. Velma Barfield understood this better than most. She kept her rooms very clean on the side that faced the street. The question Velma Barfield's story leaves behind is not about her guilt. That was established and is not in dispute. It is about the particular cost of the gap between the person a community knows and the person that community does not know, the cost that falls not on the person who maintained the gap, but on the people who trusted the face they were shown. Dolly Edwards' family trusted Velma with an 80-year-old woman who could not protect herself. John Lee Moore's family did the same. They made that judgment in good faith on the basis of everything the community had told them about who Velma Barfield was. The community had told them she was good. The community was not wrong exactly. It was incomplete. It knew the parts of Velma that Velma allowed it to know. The families of her victims have lived for more than 40 years with the knowledge that their trust was the mechanism of their loss, that the reason they did not protect the people they loved was precisely the reason they should have been able to trust that they didn't need to. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not sure anyone does. What I know is that on the night of November 2nd, 1984, 300 people stood outside a prison in Raleigh, holding candles for a woman who had poisoned at least 4 people, and that their grief was real, and that the grief of the families on the other side of the relationship was also real, and that both of those things can be true at the same time. The woman in the front pew, the woman with the arsenic in her cabinet, the woman in the pink pajamas. She was all of those things. The community only saw one of them. That gap between what is seen and what is true is not unique to Velma Barfield. It is the permanent condition of living among other people. We know each other in fragments. We trust the fragments we can see. We hope most of the time that the fragments we cannot see are consistent with the ones we can. Most of the time they are. Velma Barfield is the cost of the times they are not.